Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so very much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Wonders. I'm fantastic. This time around, we've got 3 random bits of internet. We call them in the media. So these are just 3 things that you've come across recently that made you think, made you want to talk about this for us. So we're going to be talking about pro and anti-inflammatory diets, sell-by dates, and wait for it, eating dirt. Stay tuned for this one, folks. We're going to save that one to last, though. First one. We've got an article about inflammatory diets from health.com. I think the title or the headline is Most Americans Have Diets That Promote Inflammation, New Research Says. They have to add that new research says because otherwise nobody will click on it. And the first subheadline is a new study found that nearly 6 in 10 Americans eat diets that are considered pro-inflammatory. So where do we begin with this? Maybe just that last bit, pro-inflammatory. What does that even mean?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unnecessary buzz around pro and anti-inflammatory diets. I think a lot of what makes a diet pro-inflammatory, more risky for our health in the long term, is simply eating in a way that leads to weight gain. That's it. Mm-hmm. It's not about specific foods. It's about the fact that excess weight is inflammatory. And so the headline kind of caught my eye here that like a new study found, nearly 6 in 10 Americans eat diets that are considered pro-inflammatory. I'm thinking to myself, do we need a study for that? I mean, the stats by the CDC are that 74% of Americans are overweight or obese. So right there, we could say that the diet is pro-inflammatory. And of course, there's degrees of risk here, but the heavier somebody is, the more pro-inflammatory it is because fat tissue is a source of inflammation. I think it's so easy to think about it as just a storage place. Like this is where we store away the excess energy. And it does do that, but it's also metabolically active tissue. It releases hormones. It also stores and releases sex hormones. So hormones like leptin, but also our sex hormones. It contains different immune system cells. And that is part of the reason, the immune system, why the fat tissue can be inflammatory. So the fat cells grow in size when we're eating to excess. They've got to put this extra molecules away somewhere. So the fat cells grow in size. And basically their growth rate can outpace the rate at which the cells will grow new blood vessels to supply oxygen to these fat cells. And so the fat cells can become hypoxic, deprived of oxygen supply. And this is, of course, a problem because oxygen is what allows us to create energy to do all the things that we need to do. And so this then attracts the immune cells because the various functions of these cells are not working as they should. And it's these immune cells which send out inflammatory signals, aka inflammation, in attempts that the immune system can correct the problem at the fat cells. But in this case, it's the excess weight that is the driver of this whole problem. And so for us to be able to, quote, remove the problem or remove the inflammation would require the individual to lose that extra fat that's causing the fat cells to grow inside. It would require us to be in a caloric deficit. And so I think what drives me a little bonkers about the whole pro-inflammatory diet thing is I see so much out there. It's like, too much dairy, coffee creamer is inflammatory, or like beans are inflammatory. You have this pro-inflammatory response from eating them, when really we should think about it as our first line of defense to make an anti-inflammatory diet is one that supports a healthy weight. And this is what's so interesting in the research, and we see this all the time, that regardless of the diet a person follows, if they lose weight, inflammation is reduced. So even if someone's eating a McDonald's diet and they reduce the quantity of their McDonald's such that they lose weight from where they are, it will be anti-inflammatory. And that's what we want to focus on, not necessarily, okay, I'm eating this caloric surplus and I'm also now going to eat a cup of blueberries and poof, now it's anti-inflammatory. It's no. The caloric surplus is the big driver for making a pro-inflammatory diet.
So we're talking about media, but this is also a bit of a research review. So what did the study actually do and what did it say and what can we take away from it?
So the study was looking at socio-demographic differences in what's known as the dietary inflammatory index. And I think there's some really important things about sociodemographic differences, and that's actually not what I want to talk about. I want to spend more time looking at this diet inflammatory index because this is a lot of the ways that now things are being described as a pro-inflammatory or an anti-inflammatory diet. And so they're coming up with this score called the diet inflammatory index. And basically what they did is they looked at research about, okay, what is the inflammatory response from eating different foods? And so, somebody, let's say, would eat carrots, and then they looked in the system for things called cytokines, which are these inflammatory signals I mentioned earlier, and say, okay, what happens to these inflammatory signals, these cytokines, when people eat carrots? And they'd measure them and they say, okay, well, carrots now have this type of anti-inflammatory property, right? And so they went through, I think it's about 45 different foods to assign this value to them based on what the research says about these inflammatory signals. And then ultimately they come up with like a questionnaire where people, again, check off, this is how many times I eat carrots, this is how many times I eat blueberries, this is how many times I eat processed meat, this is how many times I eat whatever, sugar sweetened beverages, so that ultimately they can come up with one final score of whether or not the person's diet is pro or anti-inflammatory. But when we look at what diets end up being anti-inflammatory according to the diet inflammatory index, surprise, surprise, they have more fruits and veggies, nuts and seeds, low-calorie beverages like coffee and tea. Mm-hmm. And then we look at the diets that are more pro-inflammatory according to index. We've got higher fat foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, red and processed meats, sweets, refined grains. And so, again, I just sort of was thinking to myself, do we need a study to say that most of us are eating pro-inflammatory? And then do we need some complicated system to really score these diets? Do we really need to like go through all of this research and looking at all these different markers that are happening in the body to be able to tell people that like maybe we shouldn't primarily eat soda, sweets, and bacon? I think we would have ended up at sort of the same accuracy if we just looked at what people are eating on a day-to-day basis. And again, they're going through this process to try to link it to inflammatory signals in the body. From a therapeutic point of view, there could very well be reasons to look at, okay, what specifically do carrots do, and do they change this signal, and how does that potentially affect a clinical outcome? But in the sense of just very big picture, looking at people's diets to say this is pro or anti-inflammatory, I do not think that the diet inflammatory index adds much. I think instead we could simply look at, okay, what's the amount of processed food in your diet, and is it leading to excess weight? In which case we then have a pro-inflammatory diet.
Are there any other anti-inflammatory properties of the mostly whole unprocessed food diet, fruits and vegetables, beyond maybe just their caloric value?
Yeah. I mean, so here I am talking about, okay, you're eating too many calories, you're gaining weight, that's inflammatory. And so sure, like fruits and vegetables have this greater amount of vitamins and minerals and fiber, and then even these phytochemicals, which are the thousands and thousands of plant compounds. And some of these vitamins and minerals and some of these phytochemicals have what are known as antioxidant or anti-inflammatory properties. Now, the thing is, how much of those compounds are really preventative in terms of chronic disease like heart disease and cancer, I still think is open to debate. Like vitamin E is an antioxidant, which means it has the ability to prevent damage from free radicals, which are these molecules that could damage cell membranes and protein and even DNA. And DNA damage could lead to cancer because it could lead to a mutation that gets replicated. But we don't seem to find that vitamin E has much effect on cancer risk. Like we found in research, it doesn't really affect cancer risk of lung cancer and urinary tract cancer and pancreatic cancer or mouth and stomach cancer. And actually vitamin E intake actually increased the risk of head and neck cancer. So it worked in the opposite direction of what we would think for something that is an antioxidant. And so we see that these vitamins and minerals and even the phytochemicals have these antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties in these animal studies and cell studies. But when we start to look at cancer and even heart disease, we don't necessarily see that same preventative effect, which is one of the reasons why I don't recommend supplements. Now, the important little nuance wrinkle here is this doesn't mean that vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals aren't preventing cancer, aren't preventing heart disease. But so far in the way that we've tested them in randomized controlled trials, we don't see that same prevention effect. This could be that it's more of the combination of all of the nutrients that exist in food are really where we're getting this positive synergistic effect, and that we shouldn't just take any single one in isolation and think it's going to do that. So it might be because of that reason that we need kind of more of a comprehensive look at all of the contributing factors within food. But of course, that's complicated to do and more work needs to be done. But I think the main point for listeners is, because I know that there's so much out there about anti-inflammatory diets, is you want to think, whenever you see anti-inflammatory diet, you want to think, okay, this isn't about adding kale or blueberry to my diet. As much as I love them, and as much as some vitamins and minerals are going to be good for maybe other function like eyesight and immune system and all this other stuff, great. You want to think when you see anti-inflammatory diet is, I first want a diet that helps me maintain a healthy weight. That is going to be the first best line of attack for anti-inflammatory, not specific food group choices.
Got it. Okay. Let's move on to our second of three. And this is, I don't know if this is an article, but I don't know if the article is the point, but it's about how California will become the first state to ban sell-by dates on food packaging, which is super interesting. Obviously, we're on the East Coast, so I didn't hear about this. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a while back. I actually really like this. I think regulations are tough. I'm not a big fan of a lot of regulations because I think a lot of things have to be nuanced and not black and white. I think we even talked about how, regulating in school, there was an argument about milk versus juice. And it's just, you think yourself like, what are we talking about here? But I think this one's really interesting because there's no consistency on the terms labels on your food with regards to its freshness. Like there will be these sell-by dates in many cases, but what does that mean in terms of consumption? Are you supposed to consume it that day because you sell it by that day? And if not, how many more days do you have to be able to consume it, right? And similarly, there's sometimes on packages like a best before date. Okay, understood. The manufacturer thinks it would be best consumed before a date because of certain peak freshness or peak taste. But let's say it's 3 days after my best before date. Like, am I going to die of botulism? Or is it just, you think the food is going to taste slightly worse? Yep. And so as this article points out, and we'll put all the links in the show notes, there's more than 50 various forms of these date and labels on packages with no real consistency in what they mean, which is surprising. I don't think I could come up with 50, but this is what the article.
I'm surprised by that number. Just for creativity's sake. I think that's
exactly
hard to do.
How many labels are we coming up with? But anyway, apparently in California by 2026, there will be 2 standardized labels. One is going to say best if used by, and then the second one will say use by, where of course the first one, best if used by, is letting us know optimal peak freshness of taste. And then use by is more to indicate product safety. And I think this is really useful for people. I mean, I think, again, with regulations and stuff, there can just be so many warning messages on the gosh darn containers that we just start not even seeing them, right? Nobody's actually reading them anymore. But I think this is one that we actually use. I mean, I use it, to actually look and be like, should I, is this thing okay to eat?
It's actually a lot of times here how we decide what dinner is. We just look at the dates and say whatever's coming up like, the soonest is what we're eating tonight.
Do we have something that in the fridge that actually can be consumed at this date? And so I'm hopeful that this will be as straightforward as it sounds, and if so, that I hope it'll be something that becomes national, not just in California.
Super interesting. What is the argument they made for why it mattered to do this, other than maybe some of what we talked about, which is like, it's just confusing, and there's 50 of them and none of them mean anything.
50 of them. Okay.
I'm going to come up with 50 of these just to see if I can
that's going to be our next little topic, 50 sell-by date variation. Okay. I think, what the article alluded to was that it kind of came out of this idea to reduce emissions and really to also reduce food waste. And when you start to look at some of the stats on food waste, it's really staggering. In this article, it says that nearly 20% of the food waste is because of this label confusion. Just in California alone, that translates to 6 million tons of unexpired food that's just thrown away in the trash every year. Regardless of what your stance or belief about climate emissions and what to do, I think everyone can get behind the idea of maybe we shouldn't be making food and then just throwing it away unnecessarily, right? Because maybe it's for the emissions, maybe it's going to help people just not spend as much on food. You just threw out the cheese, that was perfectly fine. Or maybe we can just get food into the hands of people who really need it, So I was like, okay, this is a really great idea. And I think people will be surprised when they start looking at their food after you listen to this, that it can be quite confusing at the labels. Like at first you thought, oh, this is just the date I use it by, but then you start to interpret it differently. I know one of the cheese brands I buy, it says like use within 3 days of opening. I can't finish the thing 3 days of opening. And so inevitably I've tossed away some of this stuff because I've just assumed, now it's not safe to use. I think something like this will really help reduce some of that food waste, which in my mind is really cool.
I didn't realize we were going to talk about this today, but just last night I was literally rifling through the fridge to figure out what I was going to cook. And all we had was some hamburger meat that was Best Buy yesterday, the day before, maybe even 2 days before. I looked over my shoulder to make sure Michelle wasn't looking because I was like, this is going to be fine. But if she sees it, she's going to be like, we have to throw that away.
You have to get rid of it.
All to say, I'm just going to share this episode with Michelle.
To be honest, I think a lot of things go okay when you use the smell test. Now,
yes.
Let's not try this to the extreme, everybody. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of food we end up throwing out that is quite useful. And just to have that date that's used by will give us that confirmation that, we're fine.
Okay, well, let's talk about really what we're all here for. All of that was just precursor to this one. So this is our third of three, moving from the practical to the bizarre. An article from the Washington Times, the headline, Mud Pies and Clay Pizzas. Eating dirt is the new online diet craze despite health warnings. I feel like that last part isn't necessary.
Oh, God, we're eating dirt now. I guess this is a viral trend out of TikTok and other social media platforms that you can chew on dirt, sprinkle it on your food, like a little topping, a little salad topper maybe.
Nice.
Apparently it's a way to lose weight.
Bits, but
bacon bits, but dirt bits. Hey, the TM. So apparently it's a way that you could lose weight, and it's this cure-all to digestive problems like bloating, and I guess it's even been suggested it's going to fix your acne. And
why not?
I saw this headline because I get these news alerts that I set up about diet trends and stuff like that. My first thought was like, oh my God, we will literally do anything besides eat fruits and vegetables. We will literally do absolutely anything besides eat fruits and vegetables, and we've officially reached the end of dumb ideas, right? I mean, I was thinking about it, losing weight. I mean, I guess if you replace enough of your calories with dirt, I guess you can get weight loss.
I'm no longer drinking soda. I've replaced it with mud fraps.
But I love it. It's like, okay, somebody actually goes through the process of, instead of taking a walk today and eating strawberries, let me try dirt. So here we are.
All right. I fear asking this question, but what is the rationale behind that they're using to convince people to eat dirt?
Yeah, and I'm just going based off of what the Washington Times said. I really didn't have the energy to dive into TikTok and really see what was going on here. I actually don't know what could potentially be the reason for the weight loss. I mean, again, maybe it's a caloric displacement thing. I have no idea. But one of the notions, and I've heard this before, is that, our food is, quote, too sanitized, and it's stripped of all of these nutrients and minerals needed for healthy digestion. And, in some sense that, I guess, could be correct if your food supply is Doritos and Tasty Cakes. If all you're eating is super hyper processed palatable food, then yeah, your nutrient supply in quotes is a little too sanitized in the sense that you're really not getting all of the vitamins and minerals you need that we talk about all the time. But also kind of parallel to this, there is this belief that our soil has been depleted over the years due to all this conventional farming practices. And we actually talked about in the magnesium episode that we'll link in the show notes. And yeah, there could be some loss of minerals and nutrients in the soil over time. But that does not change the fact that your best source of nutrients are still going to be whole foods, are still going to be fruits and vegetables. And it also, even if we have this decline of nutrients in our soils, it does not take away or preclude the fact that we can get all the nutrients we need from our fruits and vegetables. So even if they're not as optimal as they might have been in, 1890, we would still want to look at our fruits and vegetables, look at what's existing in them now, see if we can still hit the RDA. That's what we went through in the magnesium podcast, and we can. Now, there is also this belief, besides, this stripped of nutrient idea, there is also this belief that when you eat the soil, it contains these probiotic organisms, which is supposedly, believed to be needed for a healthy gut, and that chewing the soil is going to be this more natural version of a probiotic, which are so popular supplements, right? Soil does contain microorganisms, but you also don't want to consume microorganisms that are E. coli and Clostridium and all these other parasites that can exist in your soil. So it increases a really big risk at the expense of maybe getting something that's beneficial. And I think it comes under this classic belief we've talked about all the time, this appeal to nature fallacy that everything in nature is good and safe and everything man-made is a problem. I don't actually think people need to take probiotics, but if I'm going to take them, you better believe it's going to be from a supplement, not to walk out to my backyard and there's hope for the best. I mean, and one other thing about this too, not only do we have the fact that we can get our vitamins and minerals from other things and that we have this risk of contamination of various microorganisms that are pathogenic, but you also have the risk of contamination from things like chemical spills or oil spills or industrial pollution on your soil. I mean, typically these people want everything to be natural when you might be just getting a really high dose of arsenic because you don't really know what happened in your soil prior. So lots of other things that are a concern here besides the notion that you could be potentially getting some small benefit from maybe some of the organisms there or even some of the nutrients that may exist there.
Yeah, I think the important question is whether or not dirt will be approved on the Whole30 diet.
Oh dear.
Hopefully
not. Hopefully not.
What needs to be the case for enough people to believe, like, how did we get to a place where there's even one person who's like, you know what, you're speaking some truth right now?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I also wonder how much of it is just clickbait. Mm-hmm. There are like rage bait stuff on social media. Sometimes I'm like, is it that? It definitely will draw attention. But I do think there is, there's also just stupid ideas. There's dumb ideas and people are all connected to the internet. So there's that. Mm-hmm. But I do think there is still this mistrust of the government and that we're going to find the alternative natural solution that has not been presented to us. And, I do think a healthy amount of distrust is good. I definitely don't think that we should follow recommendations just blindly. And this is why we try to look at independent research outside our own country. What are other people doing besides, just being so US centric? But what's so interesting to me about distrust of the government is even when we look what they say about their recommendations, we find that people aren't following them. Mm-hmm. So like the USDA says we need to eat more fruits and veggies, but then they also tell us that 80% of people aren't eating enough of them. And the same similar statistic that enough people aren't exercising. So it's just interesting to me, like people will look around and will be like, oh my gosh, we're all getting sicker. To me, it's hard to say that the USDA is trying to kill us. I mean, if everybody was following their recommendations and everybody was eating all the fruits and vegetables that they said, and everyone was exercising enough to what they said, and everyone wasn't smoking and wasn't drinking to excess, and then we still had all of this epidemic that was getting worse and worse and worse every year, then I think it gives us a little bit more fodder to say, like, you know what? Maybe they're leading us down a wrong path. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should look into alternative solutions. Hopefully not dirt, but maybe supplements or additives. That would be the time when I could get more on board with, okay, maybe we should look at supplements. Maybe we should consider all these additives. But when we have this combination of, okay, they've given us these recommendations, which no one is following, and these recommendations have been confirmed by kind of independent research and outside scientists, I really don't know how something like the dirt solution gains traction. I think, again, there's just this general underlying belief that natural is always better, as we've discussed, and then a distrust of recommended guidelines that lead people to some really, really wacky ideas.
I think this is the inevitable end of the paleo discussion.
That's right.
Eventually, we were going to get to
Eventually, they will end up at dirt.
All right, let's maybe wrap this up, maybe with something perhaps a little more helpful than don't eat dirt. Right. Hopefully everybody out there listening doesn't really need to be reminded of that. But you did mention probiotics. Can we talk about that for a minute? Because we've mentioned them in the past. I don't know that we've ever done a whole episode on them. What are they? What can we know? What do we need to know about probiotics?
Yeah, they definitely are a popular supplement. And we did touch on them a bit in the overall gut health podcast. Right. But yeah, I mean, probiotics are these live microorganisms, and you can consume them. When you consume them in a supplement form, they're known as probiotics, but along your GI tract, you've got thousands and thousands of different species of microorganisms. Now, mostly they're in the large intestine, which is your colon. And which species you have and how many are present really do impact your immune system and therefore your overall health. Now, the mainstream belief about taking probiotics is like, okay, so I want to have this composition of microorganisms that have more of the good guys than the bad guys. So I'm going to take the probiotics, which are the quote good guys, and that's going to help balance the species I have to be better and therefore positively impact my health. The problem there is we don't really see that play out, in part because we don't actually know what an ideal composition of this gut health should be. There's thousands of species. We don't have one fingerprint of like we all should look like this, because it turns out that health can look a lot of different ways. Now, we do have specific health conditions where taking a specific probiotic, can alleviate those symptoms, but you're going to want to choose a probiotic that actually has research on it related to that condition that you want to alleviate. You don't just want to walk into the store, take the first probiotic you see and be like, okay, it's a good thing, right? We don't have evidence of that. Instead, how you would promote a healthy gut in the absence of any of these conditions would be to eat fruits and vegetables, really eat whole unprocessed foods, including some other things like whole grains and nuts besides fruits and vegetables. But fruits and vegetables are going to be your best option. And that's because what you're actually doing with things like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, is you are feeding the good bugs the energy, the supplies they need to increase in their population. And it's primarily through fiber. And so this is what you're getting when you eat a lot of plant foods, is you're getting different fiber types. I know we describe it as just one big umbrella term, fiber. There's different fiber types that will help different populations, and also the phytochemicals, which we've already discussed, all these thousands of compounds that are in the plant foods. Those also influence what populations are present. So to optimize your gut health in the absence of any obvious disease or condition that's been diagnosed, the best way to do it is to not take a probiotic, but to give the microorganisms in your gut the fuel sources which will allow the good ones to thrive. And no surprise, it's going to be whole, unprocessed foods.
All right. Thank you, EC. And now I don't have to eat dirt. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening.
Woo!
Yes, thank goodness. Got all the way to the end of that episode before I was really calm. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. Thank you for sharing the show with your friends, EC, and I appreciate it. We'll be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.